Rome has the Colosseum and Forum. London has its Tower and Bridge. The smallest town to the largest city has a distinct area from where it then grows. For Portslade, this fertile land can be found just to the east of Portslade Old Village. Now generally called the Emmaus site, this 6 acres has been fundamental to the development of modern Portslade. Back in 1130, the Normans built a manor house here, the first stone building in Portslade. Next followed St Nicholas Church and, very soon, a hamlet of buildings was springing up in the vicinity. By 1805, a new grand manor house has been built, surrounded by tended gardens and lawns. But our story begins in 1904, when the manor house is put up for sale. Portslade villagers are expecting another wealthy person to join the band of prosperity that already resides in Portslade. But a surprise! The house and extensive grounds are sold to be used as a convent. The congregation of the poor servants of the Mother of God have purchased the large Georgian building and the adjoining land to provide schooling and refuge for vulnerable women. At this time, these could be former prostitutes or those who had children out of wedlock. This religious order had been founded in 1872 by Frances Margaret Taylor, later known as the Venerable Mother Magdalene of the Sacred Heart. Miss Taylor had served as a nurse in the Crimea War and worked with Florence Nightingale. She later toured Ireland and Poland, working with the poor to better their lives. These experiences led to her starting soup kitchens in London and then later the religious order. However, by the time Portslade Manor was purchased in 1904, Mother Magdalene had died. The manor costs £6,700. That's about 4.5 million today's terms, but the sale included the large manor, 3 cottages and 20 acres of land. The money was donated by 40-year-old Kathleen Nelson. Miss Nelson was of Irish parentage. Her family had extensive land holdings in County Meath and had interest in a shipping company which imported refrigerated beef from Argentina. The number of convents in Great Britain rose dramatically in the last quarter of the 19th century, from 3,000 to just over 10,000. Many were purpose-built, but some were also adapted from existing buildings, such as the convent at Portslade. In the Portslade Manor, a large downstairs room was converted to be used as a temporary chapel. The sisters hoped that the founding of a refuge would also lead to a Catholic mission being established in the neighbourhood. At this time, there were just 20 people out of a population of 4,000 in Portslade whom held the Catholic faith. At first, the sisters and residents lived in the manor house. Very soon, a small laundry was started to both employ residents and raise money. As numbers grew, temporary accommodation was added to house the nuns and the vulnerable women, referred to by the order as penitents. The 1911 census shows there were 58 women living at the convent, the vast majority of them from Ireland. The ages range from 20 to 54, with the Mother Superior, Sister Bridget, the person in charge of the convent, being 42 years of age. For the remaining 57 names on the census, it is unclear as to who are the nuns and who are the penitents. A purpose-built laundry was erected in 1911 and it was gradually extended. As with most Magdalene institutions, the commercial laundry was a vital source of income. Although many convents received donations, they were nonetheless required to generate their own revenue. According to Dr. Kate Jordan of the University of Westminster in her PhD thesis, the laundry provided ideal for a range of very practical reasons. Her words are read by a local researcher.
At the start of the 20th century, it was an industry dominated by female workers and was therefore considered suitable for women. Work could be undertaken and managed internally, there was a constant demand for services, and it was demanding physical work that ensured that penitents were always meaningfully occupied. The emphasis on these laundry buildings reflects the new ways of understanding prayer that emerged in active convents. For the women who worked in the laundries, these could be spaces of devotion. It is significant that both lay women and women religious often read aloud from the Bible or sang hymns during manual work.
The first resident chaplain was Father Kerwin, who, along with the generous support of local benefactor Catherine Broderick, built the church of Our Lady Star of the Sea in 1912 in South Portslade, perhaps better known locally as St Mary's. Mrs Broderick, a widow of London Irish background, had a remarkable life. She and her late husband had risen from a very humble background to own a successful draper's business in London, and they gave over much of their fortune to the building of Catholic churches. Mrs Broderick also paid for the building of St Mary's School next to the church, in which the sisters taught. The school was opened in September 1917, but was not recognised by the local authority until 1957, greatly due to opposition from those who disapproved of Catholic education. By 1930, the number of residents in the convent was increasing. Construction work, which was planned and overseen by the nuns, began on a separate building for accommodation. They also built a large chapel so the increasing number of public worshippers could attend. The chapel is now used as a second-hand clothes shop at Emmaus. Work was completed in 1932 and gave accommodation for 80 residents. It included a new sewing room, 2 lounges, a large kitchen and dining room, now the Emmaus Cafe. The residential block was connected to the convent via a corridor, traversed by the nuns for access to the penitents' building. The nuns also retained a separate chapel within the convent for their private use. Nuns would live in the old manor house, while the penitents would live in dormitories in the accommodation block. It was at this time that women with learning difficulties began to live at the convent. At least one sister would have been present at all times in the penitents' block, and, accordingly, a room for a supervisory sister was positioned next to the dormitories. Former residents recall at no time were they allowed into the main convent building, and that door between the two buildings was always kept firmly locked. In July 1942, the convent and chapel suffered a direct hit by incendiary bombs dropped by German planes, but fortunately all staff and residents were safely evacuated. However, this did cause a problem with the sisters. Sheila Preston, who grew up in Portslade and later worked at the convent as a teacher, recalls the story. She is being interviewed alongside her daughter Paula, who often accompanied her mum to work when she was a child.
Paula's triggered a memory of the role of men in the convent. And I remember my Auntie Betty became the parish priest, Father Hayes' housekeeper. Now, I don't know if you know that the convent had an incendiary bomb dropped on it in the wartime, and the fire brigade arrived. And the Mother Superior stood at the door saying, "We're not allowed to have men in the convent." So they called in Father Hayes, who went along and said, "Come along, sisters," and led the nuns out.
Well, like a sort of, like a holy sheepdog.
Yes, that's right.
Leading
The holy sheepdog, that's right.
Leading them out.
Yes. But their rule, we're not allowed to have men in the convent.
It is interesting how priests commanded such respect and trust from the sisters. Steve Keogh was an altar boy at the convent in the mid-70s and recalls a relationship between the nuns and the priest.
There's 2 priests, and the main parish priest was Father Ruan, and he was a very nice, big, bubbly character who enjoyed, I get the feeling he enjoyed the same as we did, to be looked after, rather than being at the presbytery in Star of the Sea and having to cook his own breakfast, to be able to just turn up and be looked after by the nuns and treated a bit like a rock star. With everyone wanted to sit on his table, everyone wanted to hear his stories and talk to him, and he was a nice man. He was a very nice man, very funny, always had a story, always willing to help, but sometimes he would talk and talk, so you'd struggle to get to school on time.
Kathleen Nelson, founder of Portslade Convent, died in 1947. Mass was said for her at the chapel every week for many years after. Her grave, along with 16 other sisters and residents, sits within the Emmaus grounds, and this small piece of land is still owned by the convent order to this day. During the 1950s and 60s, public attitudes to women having children out of wedlock changed. Families became more supportive, and the need to send their daughters away was outdated. This meant that the residents of St Mary's Convent now mainly consisted of women with learning difficulties. Interventions by the state in social care now reformed the work of the sisters. In 1961, government inspectors recognised the home as efficient, and the convent was described at that time as a voluntary mental health home. Women with learning difficulties were referred from local authorities from around the country. The sisters had run a small farm on their land since they first moved to the site. This was still continuing in the early 60s and provided fresh milk, eggs and veg for the convent. The area that is now Peter Gladwin School was once used for grazing cows and growing vegetables. Sheila Preston tells us more.
I remember the cows being brown and white, and one of the residents, one of the girls as they were called, was called Blanche, and quite a strong, I think she was possibly from the countryside, she had quite a country accent, and she was the herdswoman, used to bring the cows in, and I think she must have hand milked them, because at the time the convent was self-sufficient in, obviously in milk, but also the top end of the convent grounds, the across Manor Road, was all for vegetable growing. They grew their own vegetables. But Mr. King would be like the farmer there as well. But yes, the cows would come across Drove Road there. Yeah.
So they were self-sufficient almost?
I think they probably were, because they, as I said, they grew that top part of the field beyond the grassy bit there was all ploughed up, was ploughed and planted with vegetables, and lots of them. It was like quite a big field there.
By the mid-60s, farming activities on the site had greatly reduced, and various portions of the convent estate, amounting to over 12 acres, had been sold off. This included land at Manor Road, sold to Portslade Urban District Council for housing, and land at Fordham Road, sold to East Sussex County Council as a site for what is now Hill Park School. At this point, the regime for the residents became less strict and regimented. Television was now allowed, and money allowances for the residents had been introduced. Outings to Chesington Zoo, Windsor Castle and the Isle of Wight were much enjoyed by the women. But there were other simple pleasures, like trips to the local shops.
When I first knew the convent, which is long before I worked there, they weren't allowed out in a way. They were much more enclosed than they used to be. But when the welfare state came in more, they had more freedom. I think they were allowed to have more freedom. They certainly all went out on a Saturday. They had some pocket money to spend, and they used to go down to Boundary Road, Portslade, and spend it in the cafes there. But sometimes what they were wearing wasn't what you would call modern fashion, like they'd be wearing long black stockings with their summer dresses, and that might be more done now, but it wasn't done then. People commented on how odd they looked. But you generally had a couple of older girls. They went out in groups, a couple of the older women in charge of the more able women in charge of the less able. So that's how they went.
Whilst the vast majority of women were now referred by and funded by the state, it would seem that not all residents were from the UK or Ireland.
There was an American girl who was able to read and write, quite a strong girl, and she was one of my pupils in my class. Could be quite sullen and withdrawn, really, temperamental. But Paula remembers her being picked up by quite wealthy
I remember
relatives.
you and Dad talking about her in that one Christmas, and it wasn't every Christmas, but it was one Christmas she was picked up by some very smart, official-looking cars in the plural, that were sent for her. So I remember you and Dad saying and wondering whether she was the daughter of someone rather high up in American life.
This girl, one of her jobs, and they were given jobs, they did cleaning within the convent. They did the housework, as of course they would. Everyone had a role. And she worked for one of the older nuns in there, who was one of the original teachers of the girls, who tried to teach them to copperplate handwriting. And the American girl, she suffered from hay fever. But the nun I said to her how she get on. Oh, she's very good at her housework, but she's got to get over this silly sneezing habit she's got.
In 1970, further improvements were made. The large dormitories were divided up into smaller rooms, which now house 2 residents each. 8 new double rooms were built, and the quality of the facilities were upgraded to meet modern standards. This was in addition to a day room, purpose-built stage and dressing rooms which had been added 8 years earlier. Mike Dixon was a community psychiatric nurse who visited the convent in his role for the NHS. He recalls visiting the patients in their rooms.
I actually saw the lady in her actual small kind of bedroom, because everywhere else was just in like communal areas were just very noisy, very busy, and full of residents really. You know.
What's your memories of her room? The size?
Yeah, it's just quite small and very, very plain. Yeah, very little, no decorations, nothing.
And that would be in the accommodation block that's still there now?
Yeah. And to be fair, my visit wasn't of a long duration, because I determined fairly quickly that she wasn't actually suffering from a kind of, treatable mental illness. And if anything, I think the chaos of St Mary's really wasn't helping her. It was adding to her kind of confusion and more, kind of disruptive behaviour.
By the 1970s, times were changing at St Mary's Convent. Social services were now funding the sisters' work with women with learning difficulties, and a government-led structured approach to care was now in place. Men were now employed on the site and worked as gardeners, building maintenance, and in the laundry. The laundry continued to be a good business, but things didn't always go to plan. Paula Wrightson recalls a story about her father, who worked in the laundry in the 1970s.
I've got a story to tell you about the day when my father first started working at the laundry sometime in the early 1970s, working at the Convent laundry. And he was there as a laundry hand, so he would be putting the laundry in the machines and pulling it out again and working with the girls. And in later life, he told me this story, not at the time when I was a child, he told me later, that after he'd been working in the laundry for a few weeks, and remember he had no training, he was just thrown in, one of the nuns came up to him and took him aside and said, "Oh, Mr. Huntpatch, may I just have a word with you?" "Oh yes," he said. And she said, I wonder whether you would mind putting a little less starch in the nun's underwear." And he'd obviously just been shoveling it in. I can see my dad doing that. So his claim to fame was that he starched nuns' knickers.
However, the physical building divide between the sisters and the residents continued.
When I go to Emmaus now, I always have to come out of the cafe door and look down towards the door that goes to the rest of the home, because that was the door you didn't cross, because that was going into the nuns' quarters. And what is now the first part of the Emmaus Cafe was the nuns' dining room. And the deeper part of the cafe was the workroom where all the sewing took place. And that was a big room with lots of sewing machines and things. So that it was a very definitely in two halves, the nuns' half, the girls' half.
At the heart of the convent was a religious devotion of the sisters. Services were held every morning, which were open to the wider population of Portslade. Steve Keogh was an altar boy at the convent and also a pupil at St Mary's School.
I was probably about 9 or 10 when I was being properly an altar boy. You do a bit of training. You're in the background. You never get to do anything for the first. Just wear a cassock for the first few weeks, and then you have to learn the little bits and bobs. You have to do the jobs.
Who gave you the training to be an altar boy?
One of the older altar boys, one of the older ones who'd been doing it for years. I mean, there was quite a few very old, sort of 17, 18-year-old lads who would teach you the basics.
Can you tell us about your time as an altar boy at the convent?
Yeah, certainly. Well, what happens when you got to a certain age, probably top year of primary school, so you're 10, 11, they felt you were the guy for them, you could walk to school on your own safely, etc. So you had to make your way to the convent. So yeah, one day I was asked if I would help out up there. It was 7:30, so in the morning for Mass, which was difficult to get up for to start with. And then you were on a rota with another bunch of lads.
And what did your role as an altar boy involve?
The role of altar boy, especially up at the convent, was you were on your own. So having done your training at the bigger place like the Our Lady Star of the Sea, they then trusted you to, where possible, to look after yourself. So you'd be on your own. You'd set up the priest's garb, whatever colour he was wearing for whatever part of the year it was. You'd get yourself into your cassock, and you'd go and light the candles. You'd get the altar ready, and then prepare the water and the wine and the hosts, etc., to get it ready for the Mass.
And things changed in the chapel itself, and things became more informal. And instead of the nuns sitting in long pews at the side, or stalls I think you would call them, wouldn't you, at the side of the chapel, they sat in with the congregation. And at one time there was a barrier a third of the way down, but that was taken away. So the nuns and the congregation mingled together. I think originally not particularly happily, because I remember when the sign of peace came in, there was this one nun of a man, she had to shake his hand. She really didn't quite like it, really. So that was a big change for them.
But we must not forget that this was a convent, and it was a hub of learning and activity on a tight schedule. Mass was soon followed by work.
There was no mucking about really, because I think they realised that nuns had work to do, so you'd end up probably about half an hour. There was no singing, there was no Latin, there was no psalms and no sermon. It was just from the good book.
And how many people would attend these services, and who were the audience?
The audience, for want of a better word, was we had quite a lot of nuns. So, I mean, I say a lot, they seem to be everywhere. And then you had the residents of the convent. They would all be there, getting their daily Mass, and they would be every day. And then you get a lot of the people who, going to work, so they get their Mass before they jump on their daily commute.
In 1970, a previous Superior General of the Servants of the Mother of God, Mother Geraldine O'Sullivan, gave in her book Born to Love a short summary of the work at Portslade. Her words are read by an actor.
The grounds of Portslade Manor offer every convenience for the parish Corpus Christi procession, which has taken place annually there. The people of the parish and from far outside all assemble to form a vast procession on the winding lawn. One thanks God for the growth of the Catholic population of Portslade. The sisters in Portslade had lived in the fullness of Mother Magdalene's spirit all those years, and loyally inspired all their life work in their busy apostolate.
By the 1970s, the convent had integrated into the local Portslade community and were less guarded and more welcoming of local people. The annual Summer Fete, held every June, was quite a social gathering for Portslade back in the 70s and 80s. The convent became a community hub for the local Catholic community, holding social gatherings, theatre performances and even Irish dancing.
Irish dances were organised probably around, the ones I remember were certainly around St Paddy's Day. So there was a very Irish community up there, I felt. My dad certainly went up there and knew a lot of people up there whenever he went to Mass. He'd spend ages having a smoke and chatting afterwards. But there was a room there, and I just remember on a number of occasions they'd have a barn dance or a ceilidh, and they'd have a band, and you'd be singing and dancing and having to dance with the nuns. They'd be, because they knew you, they drag you off out of your chair and get you to have a dance with them or some of the residents or whatever, and then at the end of the night they'd all be sitting, singing and having a very good time. You could tell they really enjoyed it, and maybe if they're Irish nuns, there was a little bit of home they didn't have, so yeah.
Things changed hugely because television came in, but while I was there, and you'll remember this, Paula, they had concerts that they put on where some would sing, and there was always one part of the concert where they got all the very less able women there together, and they all sang, and it was lovely. They brought huge applause. But there were some people who were quite musical, especially some of the older residents who'd been there for many years. But we also started to have dances.
I remember those vividly. The convent dance.
The convent dance.
It was a real Catholic family on the calendar to go to that.
Yes.
And it was a lot. If I remember, a lot of sort of Irish jigs. That sort of music, not pop music.
No, and I think what was astonishing at one of those dances is there was one Irish chap who danced with Sister Assumpta, and to see a nun dancing an Irish dance and being whirled, and she loved it, being whirled around. It was amazing.
From the stories we have collated from Portslade residents, the overwhelming majority of the memories of nuns have been very positive. Memories range from going to the annual fete, a kindly nun at a convent service, or for many people, memories of the nuns teaching at St Mary's School. In the case of a former mayor of Brighton and Hove, his experience was possibly life-changing.
I've been trying to fix the year. I should imagine about 1964-65. I would have probably been about 8 or 9. We'd moved up to Mile Oak, Downland Court, from the seafront at Wellington Road, where I was born. And at the time, I sneaked into the convent to get some conkers. The conkers hung over the wall, but if the ones that hung over the wall had gone, the only way to get any was to sneak in and try and knock them down off the tree inside the convent. So we snuck in, and two of the nuns actually caught us, and they took us into the front of the convent, the main entrance of the convent, and I remember it as a great staircase in front of me, although I could be entirely wrong by that because I've never seen that staircase before since. But I remember, and what would have been in my mind would have been the abbotess or lead nun coming out of somewhere. I remember as well the smell of carbolic, if I remember rightly. And she said to me, "You've been caught stealing conkers," and I rather sheepishly admitted, yes, I had been caught stealing. And she said to me, "If you promise me that you'll never steal anything else in your life, I'll give you something." So I said, "Yes, I promise you," more in the hope of just getting away as quickly as possible, but expecting perhaps a bag of sweets or something. And she disappeared for a short while and come back with a great big bag of conkers, which she handed me and said, "Now you haven't got to steal from us anymore." And that's my tale, really. And I'm not sure that I ever have stolen anything. I can't remember stealing anything, so it probably done me a bit of good. Kept me away from a life of crime.
Former altar boy Steve Keogh fondly remembers the breakfasts after midweek masses where he attended during the 1970s.
The breakfast was quite nice. I mean, although you have visions of your mum getting up and making you a fried breakfast every morning, it never happened. So to be able to go to somewhere to have a full breakfast, cereals, toasts, boiled eggs, that type of thing, brought to your table by a nun, was quite a good thing to have before you went off to school for the day.
Did you sit with the nuns or the penitents, or did you sit on your own for breakfast?
One of the nuns would come and get you when they were ready, so they would lead you into the restaurant area, and you just choose a table. But if once they sat you down, they would make a fuss of you. Not saying that you're important or anything like that, but they wanted to make you feel happy. And then sometimes the nuns would join you and have a chat. It was quite nice. I think some of the younger ones, especially there was one particular one I remember was quite active in events and stuff like that, and put on things for the convent. So she would come and sat with you and helped you get your toast and brought your eggs and that sort of stuff and made sure you were looked after and got away in time for school.
Changes in legislation in 1990 meant that the overall care of the women was now the responsibility of social services. Although the women could continue to live at the convent, there was far more involvement and scrutiny from health authorities. Mike Dixon was a community psychiatric nurse who visited the convent at this time.
I was a community psychiatric nurse employed by the NHS and was asked to go up to St Mary's to assess one of their residents. So I'd say about a year before the unit closed.
And what was your impressions of life in the convent?
I'll be honest with you, it seemed very chaotic. There were lots of women in their 40s, 50s and 60s with learning disability, and they were being cared for by a number of nuns in what is now the Emmaus kind of accommodation building. I just went in there and was just surprised how busy it was, how many residents there were, and that it just seemed very, very chaotic. And I'll be honest with you, that the actual nuns didn't seem to be able to cater and cope and care for the people that were living there.
Changes were widespread across the convent during the 1980s and 90s, and often in ways you would never think would be applicable to the sisters. Time progressed into the 70s, yes, and attitudes are changing. Did the nuns struggle to adapt to how life was modernising?
The younger nuns were, but I remember one nun who, because if you were in a convent and you were given a job, because you're in a vow of obedience, you obey that vow. And one of the sisters said her job was to learn how to drive. And of course, when they first started driving, they had these wimples round. Of course, they couldn't see. But when the new habit came in, they could see better. But she told me that as soon as they got in the car, they would start saying their Our Fathers and Hail Marys as they went on. But this nun didn't want to be a driver, but she was told she's got to drive. But yes, there was a difference between the younger nuns coming in, were more socially qualified than the older nuns who just come up through the ranks as they did in those days. So there was a big difference.
In 1994, the order decided that greater integration of residents into the community was the best model for the future. The Portslade Convent, which had been subject to so much piecemeal development over the years, was difficult to adapt to modern requirements. Thus, it was announced in November 1994 that the convent would close. A farewell service was held on May 2nd, 1997, as one era of Portslade history passed the baton to another. The site was sold to Sussex Emmaus, whose work with the vulnerable and disadvantaged mirrors the ethos of the convent and the sisters who had worked there for 94 years. For the last 1,000 years, this 6 acres of land has proven to be the hub of the Portslade community. It started with the building of a Norman manor house, where local people would work, gather, be entertained, and even attend court. One lord of the manor liked Portslade so much, he managed to secure a royal charter from King Edward II in 1312, allowing Portsladers an annual party on the village green. St Nicholas Church has seen countless services, weddings, baptisms and fidgety performances of school nativity plays. Even the building of the new manor house created a sense of community, as its owner, John Burrough, supported local charities and even built a whole wing at St Nicholas Church. St Mary's Convent, and now Emmaus, is simply adding to the rich history of the Portslade community. Who knows where the future will take us all, but I have the firm hope that this small piece of Portslade will continue to be an area of love, hope and togetherness. Perhaps the final words should rest with Sister Margaret O'Shea, who said at the convent farewell service in 1997 that, instead of saying goodbye, we were also saying hello to something new and fresh. May that freshness and reinvention continue for another 1,000 years.